All right, I am excited to get to talk with Vlad Zamfir from Ethereum, doing all kinds of really cool stuff on CBC Casper and just generally on the research side of doing lots of cool things about where Ethereum is going. At the Ethereum Community Conference here in Paris, thanks for taking a few minutes for us to have a chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I appreciate it. And so maybe just present a little bit about what you've done, why you're here, why you're a part of taking the Ethereum and Casper thing forward, just to give some context, and then we'll dive into a few questions.
Sure. So I got involved in Ethereum before launch, and I was doing work and like application level stuff, and then pretty soon I got interested in proof of stake and blockchain scaling, and so I started to do research in core infrastructure improvements on like the basic tech, and then I started to become really concerned about Ethereum governance and like blockchain and cryptocurrency governance in general. And that kind of led me to become interested eventually in what we kind of call crypto law, which is like legal issues associated with disputes about blockchains and cryptocurrency. And so my tech research has led me to do this kind of like social science research and kind of research into how people use the tech and about like, you know, kind of technology in the context of like society and people governing it, you know, and recognizing that it's not just technology, but it's, you know, when you use a protocol to solve something, there's still going to be people who have power in defining that protocol, power in governing it. You know, the protocols are not immutable; they're, you know, governed, and so there's a big kind of social, legal, political governance side to this question, right? Like if we're going to use this technology to do organization all over the world, globally, you know, we're going to have to deal with these social issues, and we can't really ignore them or pretend they don't exist. And so I spent a lot of time doing tech research, kind of consensus protocol research, distributed systems research, proof of stake market design research. And then that kind of led me to create a lot of pressure on me to do this kind of governance research, because I can't really put out tech without thinking consciously about how it's going to be used. And I wasn't super happy with the norms and culture about how people use the technology. And so I've been doing a lot of research in blockchain governance and crypto law to try to move the needle on cryptocurrency culture and to try to lead to like a more responsible environment where I can deploy this technology.
Right. So when I looked up kind of your background and a lot of things that you're focusing on, one of the first things I hit was a great article on Medium just about governance, your Governance 101 kind of article, and you might have updated some of your thinking since then, but I found that there was just a lot of really good points in there for somebody who hasn't dove into the subject real deeply. Maybe we can just talk a little bit about your definition of that. You just kind of hit on it a little bit, but then just decisions and outcomes in the context of blockchain governance. Then we can go into also the other things that we talked about that we'll discuss. But I think it's a good thing for people just who haven't necessarily dove into the nuances of that subject.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you know, blockchains have like a very specific nature. They're like software that runs in a distributed system. The software is implemented by and maintained by engineers, developers, and architects, and they have to make decisions day to day about how to maintain that software, what changes to make to that software, and people have to make decisions about whether to install that software or not, and people have to make decisions about kind of what naming and brands, trademarks are associated with different blockchains. And so there's all sorts of kind of shared resources in cryptocurrency and blockchain that like are governed actively by different processes and people throughout the ecosystem, and these and the governance of this of the protocol ends up being, you know, a super powerful thing, and it's really important for thinking about like the way that tech is used, thinking about how it's governed. You can't imagine that tech is a political, a legal, a social, a moral entity. It's very much like a human institution that exists inside like society, and so you know the tech is governed.
In this decentralized conversation, people they often will go down that road, however, in thinking that it's kind of anarchistic in that there are no rules and nobody's actually, you know, when actually there's a ton of players involved to make sure these things go in the right direction.
Although I would say that, like, you know, it's something in between where basically like there is like a very much a dominant formal rule in Bitcoin and Ethereum, which is the immutability rule. And that rule basically says that, like, you know, you shouldn't change the protocol, you shouldn't interfere with the execution of smart contracts for any kind of non-technical reason. and that is a big rule. It's like a big norm. It's a big social reality that people are very much pushing in a kind of, I wouldn't say, I mean, it is a little bit anarchistic, but mostly what it is hyper paranoid of state capture and of corporate capture. And it kind of has this position that the only way to prevent this technology from being captured is to have it be fully autonomous, which I think is not true. I think, like, I don't think we have to choose between state capture and fully autonomous software. I think there's like a middle ground where we have like good governance that isn't captured by, nation states or corporations or any kind of superpower.
Right. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So your other big interest, crypto law.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Maybe just highlight why that interests you and just some perspectives on where you think things are at. There's been a lot of evolution, especially last year, but just the world catching up with where the researchers and the developers are wanting to take cryptocurrencies and blockchain in general. So in terms of the legal side of that, crypto law, again with the governance piece of it.
Yeah. So crypto law is basically like the structure and the ways in which the conflict about cryptocurrency play out.
Right.
Like laws kind of describe the way that disputes play out, and laws in general about disputes and conflict. And we have kind of legal tradition nowadays that focuses on dispute and conflict with nations in within national bounds, and a legal tradition that's kind of for most people the way they understand law is as rules that are enforced by some kind of
sovereign, generally,
something like that, like some kind of state kind of entity. But law fundamentally is just about disputes, and the enforcement of rules is one way to manage disputes.
Okay.
And in crypto, because we're talking about global protocols, I don't necessarily think that it's very likely that the legal order is going to be one of where we can agree on rules and how they're enforced. And
there is no geography, so we can't depend on a geographic kind of power to apply those norms.
And furthermore, if we tried to create some kind of global state that governs global crypto protocols, it would have potentially legitimacy problems, and people might disagree with the decision and fork away. And so I think that crypto law is going to be much more characterized by conflict in cryptocurrency between various kinds of actors who want to have debate and disputes over protocol definitions, protocol naming, protocol use, implementations, etc.
Okay.
And so I think that crypto law is fundamentally about disputes about protocol, blockchain, cryptocurrency, kind of related protocols. And governance is kind of about decisions. Politics, on the other hand, is about power. And I think actually law is somehow fundamentally more complex than law is more complex than governance and politics, because conflict is more complex than the decision space and the power dynamics, because conflict is between people and between players. And so I think crypto law is its structure, it's a really important part of blockchain governance. And I think, for example, immutability, I recognize it as a crypto legal norm. It basically is a norm about how we have disputes about protocol that basically says the way that we have them is outside the protocol, the way we have them is not by changing the protocol. Right.
So if we have this overarching concept of immutability, then we have to bake the rules in from the beginning and get them right. The law matters. Otherwise, then we have problems later of having to change things.
In my opinion, the immutability, and it's just not possible. It's just not possible for us to do that given today's reality of the information that we have. And so basically the result is that to me, immutability is not legitimate.
Okay.
It's like a crypto legal norm that I disagree with. I don't agree that immutability is how we have disputes in crypto. I don't think that is legitimate. I don't think it's
because we can't do it technologically yet, or because why is it?
Because it's like a total deviation from the way that law works anywhere. Okay. I mean, law is about conflict and disputes. To create a piece of software and say this is above dispute, beyond dispute, you cannot dispute this, it to me is an inherently immoral and unlawful position, just philosophically. Okay. Right? Now that said, it's obviously become adopted as a legal norm, And so it's like, in some way, breaking immutability is unlawful today inside cryptocurrency. But the legal order in crypto is very deviant relative to legal order.
So for you, the legitimacy problem is not can we do it, but should we?
So legitimacy, there's two things, right? There's kind of like legitimacy as in like authoritativeness, as in like, in fact, whether or not people will go with it. And then there's the legitimacy in like a normative sense of like, should this be the way it is, right? And what happens is, if you have something that's not legitimate, if, for example, there are like clear moral objections, clear legal objections, it undermines the stability of the norm. And basically, because immutability doesn't really give a fuck about anything that happens outside of the code, right? Because the code is above dispute. There are lots of edge cases where people are caused harm by fully autonomous software. And I think that makes the immutability norm kind of unstable, at least as we're currently interpreting it and adopting it. And so I think that like the immutability norm is unstable. And I think that like in crypto today, what that basically means is that like there's a huge vacuum in crypto law, because the predominant ways that we have disputes about cryptocurrency and blockchain tech for the dominant blockchains is kind of leaves a lot to be asked for, and creates big vacuums for blockchains to say things like, look, we're legally compliant blockchains. We're going to just do whatever US regulators say. Oh, look, we're like a national blockchain and we'll do whatever our nation state's legal system wants. And that creates demand for that kind of thing. And that's also very risky, because what happens is blockchains and cryptocurrency protocols are global. And so then you're talking about basically a kind of global imperialist setting where one government or one legal system gets to propagate their legal order to the world. And I think that obviously there's obvious legal problems there, because we don't live in a single polar world where like a single legal system gets to dominate. We have like international law and global law. And international law and global law in crypto today, the only real option that we have is we have basically like immutability and corporate governance style blockchains, where basically there's like some set of owners who like are maybe internationally dispersed, but they like are kind of owning the blockchain in some way. Either they own coins in a formal governance model where they can change things, or it's a permission blockchain where there's like a governance council or something where there's a bunch of corporations who together govern it. Right. And so we basically have immutability and corporate governance styles available in a global governance, international law kind of setting. And I think both are legally very lacking. If we think about this in terms of like separation of powers and like creating a system where people can keep each other in check, immutability creates a situation where where there's like no guarantee at all that people will have their their interests represented, because like nothing changes no matter what. Right. And corporate governance is going to be dominated by the owners, and the owners have basically no checks against their power in these models. And so basically, I think we have like a big crypto law opportunity to do way better than we're doing on a global international law basis. So we can avoid outcomes like fully autonomous software, like corporate blockchains colonizing the world, or like some national legal system using blockchain to spread their particular crypto law to the world. And so I think there's a big opportunity for us to redefine and reinterpret how we have disputes about blockchains and cryptocurrency protocols in a way that's globally legitimate, but which isn't this, in my opinion, crazy fully autonomous software immutability, and isn't an imperialistic thing where a nation state gets to dictate to the world how crypto and blockchain is governed, or a thing where like some corporations get to dictate it. I think that like we could do much better, and it's like kind of a matter of governance and law, and and people participating, knowing that these are like governance and legal questions, as opposed to trying to act like they're tech questions.
So if we just go a little bit further down that path in terms of one of the places where immutability has run into a lot of friction would be GDPR or now CCPA compliance. Do you have any thoughts on that side of things?
Of course. I mean, immutability and fully autonomous software are huge data protection issues. I mean, basically the philosophy is we don't care, there's nothing we can do like one of the two. You know, we don't care, or there's nothing we can do. The reality is, you know, there are certain things that could be done technically, although there's limits also on what the power of blockchain governance, because like, you know, they're like, you know, you can't really change the contents of a block without changing the hash of that block, without disrupting the continuity and like the authentication of the blockchain. And so like there's definitely technical limits to what can actually be done to try to deal with some of these issues. Right. But right now our philosophy isn't we'll do whatever we can, recognizing that there's limits to what we can do. Our philosophy is there's nothing we can do for you because it's immutable. Right. Which I think is you know, it's just not a fact that it's immutable. It's more like a crypto legal doctrine. It's like a crypto law regime, which in my opinion is like unstable because it's founded on basically fallacies about like the fact that like the only way to avoid this thing from being captured is for it to be fully autonomous.
No, it's fascinating, and I don't think these questions are asked. I think it's assumed by a tremendous amount of people that immutability is there. It's a choice that's been made. It exists. Move on.
Because here's what happens, right? People propagate technology with a tight association with the legal doctrine about how people have disputes about it. And so when you learn about blockchain, you learn about immutability. It's inseparable.
A given, so okay.
It's almost inseparable in the education. And so when people are learning about the tech, they're also learning about how they're supposed to have disputes about the tech. And so like, you know, we basically have this kind of international legal order that's set up through education that's associated with technology. And that's incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous because, I mean, immutability is fully autonomous software, but you could imagine people using the same technique of associating legal doctrines with technology and propagating it to the world to propagate all sorts of legal orders, which are, you know, and it could be worse than immutability, although it's hard to imagine. For me, it's hard to imagine what could be worse than fully autonomous software, but it's possible to have legal orders that are worse than fully autonomous software. And the fact that people aren't really mindful of this trick of, you know, associating legal doctrines, legal stories with technology super tightly in order to propagate a legal order with the technology, you know, means that basically there's very few actors in the space, very few people who are kind of doing this, and so who is going to keep them to account? Like, how do you have conflict with someone who is basically acting in a world where almost no one is conscious of what they're doing?
No, it's fascinating. I think it's good to have voices out there pushing people back into this more philosophical space, making sure that we then potentially apply that and not just have it be ideas and discussions, but how do we change potentially this to move forward. But changing gears a little bit, because I do want to touch on it. You're the lead on CBC Casper. Anything that you want to kind of just share in general about where that's at, where we're going? There's lots of great stuff coming with ETH2. So is there, you know, just a quick thoughts from you at the top of that, and where things are going?
Yeah, so, you know, the CBC Casper roadmap is like a research roadmap. We're concerned with building correct by construction consensus protocols that are like scalable and secure and have all sorts of nice properties. We do formal specification, formal verification. We do fundamental research. We kind of have like more of a research agenda than ETH2. ETH2 is kind of an implementation agenda that's kind of trying to release something that can be implemented really soon for Ethereum. Okay. I'm concerned about like a lot of design requirements that aren't available in ETH2, and so CBC Casper, like sharding architecture, you know, is going to be, you know, in my opinion, like really nice. I mean, it has a whole bunch of features that aren't in ETH2, but the timeline for release is further out. Okay. And the way that ETH2 interacts with my roadmap is like a little unclear. The way that ETH2 interacts with Ethereum 1.0 roadmap, I think, still a little unclear also. You know, but basically, you know, I'm working on technology and getting basically formal specifications, verification, and then eventually we're going to have implementations, production implementations, and release. But you know, the way that I work as like an architect and a researcher is like I want to finish the architecture specification first. And then I'm going to hand it off to engineers and developers who are going
to implement
it. Yeah.
Okay. Great.
And you know, I'm super optimistic about the work. It's going. I mean, we have really amazing properties in our consensus protocols. Like we can do the same overhead as Nakamoto consensus, but have asynchronously safe finality. You know, we have really nice kinds of properties. And like it's theoretically very, very elegant. And you know, you should check it out. I'm gonna have a paper coming out soon.
Good.
On which just goes through in just heavy detail at all the CBC Casper research. One interesting area where CBC Casper research deviates from lots of the space is I do typed fault tolerance analysis instead of Byzantine fault tolerance analysis.
Okay.
You know, there's this tradition of Byzantine fault tolerance analysis where a node is considered to be, instead of having the correct software, is exhibiting arbitrary behavior, which could attack the protocol, and that arbitrary behavior is untyped. It could be anything. But what it turns out is that for protocols that are validating, where you kind of, whenever any message comes in, you check whether it's a valid protocol message.
Right.
You don't need to do Byzantine fault tolerance analysis because there's only so many messages that could possibly come in, so many ways that it could come in, that you can actually do a typed analysis and see all the possible execution traces without looking at undefined behavior.
Okay.
And so the basic methodology that we're using to design these consensus protocols is a bit deviant. It's a little bit more typed and you know, like than traditional Byzantine fault tolerance analysis, and that lets us do some cool things, like for example, not have an in-protocol fault tolerance threshold. Like normally you hear that like there's like this 1/3 maximum fault tolerance threshold, and that's like a Byzantine fault tolerance analysis thing. In typed fault tolerance, it's much more complicated than that. I mean, you have different thresholds for different properties,
right,
and there's like trade-off between them, and the thresholds are against faults of a particular type. So like we can have safety as long as we have not more than some number of this kind of fault. And we have liveness as long as we don't have more than some number of this other kind of fault.
Okay.
And it ends up being the mode of analysis and design, you know, it's quite different from tradition. Also the protocols are really, really simple. I have like really, really simple proofs and protocols. It's like way easier to understand than Paxos and KBFT and these kinds of traditional consensus protocols. And so I think, you know, I mean, I have a lot to say about the tech, but I don't know if it's super organized right now.
No, but that's great. That's just to get some highlights of it and to see where things are going. So no, we crossed a bunch of good things, and I appreciate your time. I'm sure this was going to be very useful for people who are maybe a little new to some of the thoughts around governance and crypto law, and also just good to hear your perspective on where Casper deviates a little bit where you want it to go. I
mean, ultimately,
so
I'm hoping to do like an Ethereum release, and you know, like maybe we'll call it Ethereum 3.0. I don't know.
Awesome.
We'll see.
Very good. Thanks, Vlad. I appreciate your time. Enjoy Paris.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter